Good morning. And if it is not apparent already, as you saw on the screen, we are still in the book of Judges. We have a couple of more lessons to go. We are still going to be talking about the life of Gideon and his work in delivering the people of Israel out of oppression at the hands of the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the peoples of the east. And as we've said in the past, that could be a reference to who the Midianites and the Amalekites are. Our lesson today is entitled Leadership Lessons of a Conqueror. And as you can see that we're going to be looking at Judges chapter 7, verses 23 to 24. I mentioned last time that we're going to sneak in verse 25. I think that's going to be an important note. It's the last verse of that chapter. And then we'll look at verses 8, or chapter 8, verses 1 through 9. So if you'll turn there quickly, we'll get started here in a moment. One of the things I want to mention as we get ready to look at this lesson, and I'll be sure and bring up a couple of points at the end as well, is to think about Gideon as a leader, and then also to recognize his humanity. We've seen a number of things regarding the development of Gideon through this time period together. We saw how he was shy and very lacking in self-assurance. We've seen him doubt God, and we've seen him trust God and obey God. And as we saw in the last couple of lessons, how God worked through Gideon to bring about victory. What we're going to see today is that the work of pursuing the oppressors out of the land continues. But one of the things we're going to see is some activity and decision-making by Gideon that, if we're honest with ourselves as we read the text, we may be troubled by it. And I just want to assure you at this point that as you read it, it's okay. And the reason I say that is at this point, we've seen Gideon grow, and we might be at that point where we think Gideon can do no wrong. But if we're really honest with ourselves as we read the text, particularly getting into chapter 8 and all that's going to transpire from there, and then also think about what happens after Gideon dies and his son leads the people of Israel for a while, you may really be troubled. And I just want to say that's okay. It does mean that we have to look at the lesson or look at the text in a particular way to see what there is that God has us to learn from it. But at the same time, I don't want us to have an unrealistic view of who Gideon is at this point. Now, with that said, you're probably understanding that I'm going to say a couple of things that are not too kind about Gideon. We started off that way a little bit. We praised him when he was worthy of praise. And there are going to be some times here where we at least question his actions at this point. And I want us to do that. So as we get started, I just want us to look at the text. I want to go ahead and pull up the screen again on what we're going to be looking at in terms of where we are in the cycle, as well as give a brief outline of the text that we're going to be looking at today. So let me go ahead and get us started there. And let me find it real quick. Pull that up. And you're going to see there on the screen again the lesson title. But let me go ahead and pull up where we are in the cycle. As we said, each time we look at the text, we're in the middle of the cycle, this time of Gideon, where the people sin, they are oppressed by outsiders, they cry for help. And we have spent several chapters or several parts of 2 chapters, and we'll get into a 3rd chapter here today on the deliverance process, looking at Gideon. We will eventually turn that last arrow over where final reference to Gideon dying and land having peace for a while will come into play. We're going to be looking specifically at parts of chapter 7 and parts of chapter 8. And the leadership lessons of a conqueror is again our title. We're going to look first in verse 23 of chapter 7. In many of your Bibles, chapter 7, verse 23 is the very last verse in a paragraph. We'll talk about that. But we'll see here some northern tribes are going to be called and summoned to help. Then we're going to see at the end of chapter 7, beginning of chapter 8, a reference to the tribe of Ephraim. And we've seen them participate before. We'll see them participate here. But there'll be a little bit of a conflict between Ephraim and Gideon, I should say, as we get started. And then the last thing we're going to see is in verses 4 through 9, chapter 8, the pursuit of the Midianite kings. And I will say that as we get started, what we're going to find is the fact that this is the beginning of another stage in the pursuit. We're only going to be looking at the beginning part of this, but we will make reference to a couple things moving forward, as well as conclude this when we get to that lesson next week. Well, I want to show you another map real quickly just to show you where we're going. I'm going to read the text in a moment, but while I've got the PowerPoint up, let me go ahead and show you what we're looking at. Want us to see here first that this top text box represents the Valley of Jezreel, where all of the battle began. We saw that in the following the breaking of the pitchers and the blowing of the trumpets, the people of Midian attacked themselves, and then eventually they came to their senses, and many of them moved away. They made their way down to Abel Meholah, and or Meholah, and we have that right about here. You can see the red dot. If you can see a little bit, I tried to put in the name there so you can have some reference. What we're going to see today then is they're going to continue pursuit down to the area south, further south in the region. You'll forgive that little blip. And then we're going to see references to Sukkoth and Penuel. We're also going to see a reference to Beth Barah, and I'll talk more about that. But I want to have you get a sense of this because some of these places aren't actually listed in your Bible maps. But this is where we're going to be looking. We're going to be looking at this region here and then over here as we get started. So let me go ahead and pull that back up, pull me back up, and let's go ahead and get started in the lesson. As I said, there are going to be times when we're going to be conflicted about the Bible characters that we're reading. And as we read Gideon, that's not going to be any different. We like him, but then we question him, and we may roll our eyes a little bit. We may shake our heads. We want to root for Gideon. We want to root for the fact that God is loving Israel and wanting to deliver Israel. And he's using human instruments to get the deliverance of his people there. And so we just have to wrestle with the text. And as I said, and will say, there are times when we look at a biblical character and we look at them for the sake of trying to figure out what are some qualities that we can emulate, but certainly what are some qualities and characteristics that we need to avoid. Well, let's go ahead and look at the first point of our outline, chapter 7, verse 23. And we're going to be looking at just a reference to some northern tribes. First, it says this: "Then the men of Israel were called from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh, and they pursued the Midianites." Remember last week or last lesson, we talked about the fact that after the people were scattering, they left, they headed southeastward. Then they made it to Beth Shittah, and then showed you where Abel Meholah was. And so we see the pursuit there. That's with just the 300. Now what Gideon has done is called people from the various tribes. A couple of these tribes, all of these tribes were originally mentioned earlier in chapter 6 when we were setting up for battle to begin with, before Gideon had the first interruption where he asked for the fleece. And so we have then the limiting of the army from Israel from 32,000 down to 10,000 down to 300, and now they're pursuing. It is interesting that after God has given them deliverance in a brief manner, and the oppressor is on the run, they are chasing. And not only are they chasing, Gideon is calling for reinforcements. And the question is, was he wrong in doing this? Remember, God had said that he would bring deliverance for Israel through these 300. And yet now there are more joining, and we're not done with more joining. We'll see, as we said a moment ago, the tribe of Ephraim is going to jump in, and they're going to jump in because Gideon's going to call for them. Real quick note, what's interesting is that of the tribes that are mentioned, again, those are Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh. Naphtali and Asher are northern tribes. Manasseh is a northern tribe, but it's the top half, and that's the tribe where Gideon was from. What you don't see is any reference to Issachar. Now, really where the battle began in the Valley of Jezreel is right there on the border and getting into the southern part of Issachar. I won't show you the map again, but you'll want to go back and look at that and see how Issachar is played out in here. There may have been some of the original 32,000 that were from Issachar. Maybe there are a couple of the remaining 300 that were from Issachar, but we have no way of knowing that. The tribe in and of itself is not mentioned. However, they did help when Deborah and Barak were in the same region fighting against Jabez and Sisera, the Canaanite leaders. And so maybe they're there, maybe they're not. Maybe it's an oversight on the author's part to mention them, maybe purposeful in not mentioning them. But they are not mentioned as a group by the tribe. And it's, again, ironic to me, since the battle and the staging of the battle area was in the northernmost part of Manasseh and right at the border and into Issachar. So just a curiosity for me. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, maybe not. One other curiosity, however, is that while Zebulun was mentioned in chapter 6, verse 35, when originally summoning people to come for battle, there were some from Zebulun that were among the 32,000 originally. Maybe there are some that are left that are part of the 300, but when the summoning for more reinforcements went out, there's no mention of Zebulun, just like there's no mention of Issachar. I think it's interesting to see what is mentioned and what is not mentioned. But what I want you to picture now is the fact that you have the remaining Midianite army, and we'll find out exactly how many that is when we get through further into the text, but they're fleeing, excuse me, and now you have all of these others pursuing them. As they are going south, then we're going to read where the tribe of Ephraim is going to come in at the request of Gideon. So let's go ahead and read chapter 7, verses 24 and 25, and then jump right into chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. And we're going to see the help of Ephraim, but we're also going to see the challenge of Ephraim against Gideon as a result of their being called in so late. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. Verse 24 says, Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim with this message: come down to intercept the Midianites and take control of the watercourses ahead of them as far as Beth-Bada and the Jordan, or some translations may say even the Jordan. In other words, be right there where the fords or fjords were getting into the river. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they took control of the watercourses as far as Beth-Bada and the Jordan, or again, even the Jordan. They captured Oreb and Zeb, two princes of Midian. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb while they were pursuing the Midianites. They brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon across the Jordan. Now, real quick before we move on, one of the things we have to recognize is that many with, or the 300 with Gideon, have now made their way across the Jordan because the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the peoples of the east have already crossed over. And so that's where they are going. That's not mentioned yet, but you get that hint right now when we're told that the Ephraimites go ahead and take the heads of Oreb and Zeb, or Zeeb, to Gideon across the Jordan. Let me read what they said. The men of Ephraim said to him, why have you done this to us, not calling us when you went to fight against the Midianites? And they argued with him violently. So he said to them, what have I done now compared to you? Is not the gleaning of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer? God handed over to you Oreb and Zeeb, the two princes of Midian. What was I able to do compared to you? And then the conclusion is rather interesting. When he said this, their anger against him subsided. Well, one of the things we can see here is as they're pursuing further south, what Gideon does is he calls out for men from Ephraim who are in that central region. They still have a little ways to go, but they make it through the mountain passes, and they are going to try and intercept the armies of Midian, those that are fleeing. And really what they're doing is they're trying to block them from going further south, probably closer to the northern part of the Dead Sea, and making an easier passageway to make it down to what would be known as their main homeland, southeast of the Dead Sea. And what they're doing is keeping them from going there. So what they're doing is they're going to try and trap them. The way the trap is going to work, of course, is that this means that the Midianite army has to cross more in the north, as you saw, and now they're in an area where they're not close to home. They have a long way to go. And so what happens is Gideon takes them across with his 300, and now Ephraim has done their job. They blocked the people from crossing, pushed them back a little bit, then the people went across. They find Oreb and Zeb, and they kill them. These are two princes, two leaders in the Midianite army. It's the same word, for instance, that was used, I believe, of Sisera when Deborah and Barak battled the Canaanites. And what you have here then is the first mention of any leadership from Midian. We've not mentioned any leadership. Again, even though I've given the number away a couple of times in previous lessons, we technically don't know how big the army of the Midianites coalition is either. But we find that they have found them, and we're told that Oreb and Zeb have been captured and killed. And what the Midianite men do then is they cut off their heads and they take the heads to Gideon. Now, The Bible is reporting it. The Bible is not necessarily approving it or in any way criticizing it. What we've said in the past is that there were things that took place in that culture that were matters of the way war was fought. A very practical reason one author suggested for doing this is that it did prove that they were dead. They didn't have pictures back then. They didn't have DNA testing and all of those things that we can use today to prove who a person is. And many would say, even on a practical level, it would be too much to carry the bodies. It's just easier to carry the heads. I don't want to get caught up into that. That's what I've been reading. That's what I've been studying. And it's interesting to note that they do that. But there are a couple of other features that come into play as well. They go back, they take the heads to Gideon and report that they have killed him, or they have killed these two men. Interestingly enough, Oreb was killed on a rock and Zeb was killed in a wine press. Later, or at some point, they named these places the Rock of Oreb and the wine press of Zeb. Certainly later readers of this text would recognize those places. We can't locate those places today, but they were named after that. It's not like they went to their own rock and his own wine press. Those were named later. Curious, though, how this language plays into our narrative. Remember that when God encountered Gideon through the angel of the Lord, Gideon was threshing wheat at a wine press. And when Gideon pressed the angel for a sign, he was told to put the offering that he was bringing the angel of the Lord on a rock. I don't want to press it too much further, but you do have a literary connection there. A rock and a wine press at the beginning, and now here near the end of the story as well. Both of these, of course, as I said, are associated with the call of Gideon. Side note to a side note, there's no real significance in terms of how this fits into the battle, but Oreb means raven and Zeb means wolf. Thought you would want to know that because that's what I found out. Well, they approach Gideon, they present the heads, and then out of nowhere, it seems, they come against Gideon for not calling for help sooner. Ephraim complained, and the text that I just read from the CSB said violently. This is really strong language. This is language of accusation. It's almost civil war cry language, that they are so upset with him. We're going to see similar language later. I'll bring up a point in a moment with regard to Ephraim in a later incident that doesn't go as well for them. But here we want to just point out two things. One, first, the complaint of Ephraim. They've been sitting back. They've helped before. They were very much involved in the battle that Deborah and Barak led against the Canaanites. They've been sitting back doing nothing, and then all of a sudden they get called. They help. They immediately respond to the call. They do what they are asked to do, but then they're upset that they don't get to help sooner. And so they call out to Gideon on that. Then Gideon gives a response. As I said, Ephraim is so mad, maybe there's an attempt at some kind of rebellion. We don't know for sure, but we know that what Gideon does puts that aside so that it doesn't happen. Now, Gideon speaks 4 sentences in response. 2 of them are practically the same thing. He begins and ends with, "What have I done compared to you?" And then he says 2 other things in the middle. He says, "Is not the gleaning of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer?" And then he also says, "God handed over to you Oreb and Zeb, the 2 princes of Midian." Well, a couple of things to note about that. First, again, he asks the question, "What have I done compared to you?" The question implies the answer, nothing. I've done nothing compared to you. And he's acknowledging that they have done a great deed in Israel. And he's acknowledged that he's not really the one doing the work. What he's not done, interestingly enough, is said, "Why are you coming at me?" God said that he would be the victor. God told me to reduce the army and leave it at 300. Now, again, we do know that after they pursue the Midianites, then what happens is Gideon does call people from the north. And as he's passing through, he calls out for the people from Ephraim. But he says, "I've not really done anything compared to you." Maybe he's referring to what took place in the past with Barak and Deborah. Maybe he's just talking about their general strength. Then he mentions the fact that even his even the gleaning of the Ephraimites is better than the grape harvest of Abiezer. Of course, we know that Gideon was from the north in that region in northern Manasseh, and he was found at a wine press, but his job was really like a farmer making bread. We'll talk about that in a moment. But what happens is he's making a comparison. The gleanings would be the leftovers. He says, you guys, what you pick up from the grape gleanings, what's left over, is much better than the full harvest, the complete grape harvest of Abiezer. So he's speaking well of them. He's giving them strong compliments. You can question whether he's doing that to simply appease them or if he's giving them a real, true compliment. And then he goes on to say this. God did this for you. I may have called you, but God is the one who gave them into your hands. And then he concludes again with the fact that he hasn't done anything compared to what they've done. In fact, he says, what was I able to do? Not only what did I do, but what was I even able to do? So he's giving them strong affirmation at this point. Well, as I said, he mentions God at this point. That might have been a good opportunity for him to say, not only did God hand them into your hands, he's been behind this the whole time. He doesn't do that. I don't know why he doesn't do that. Some of us may be on the defensive at times and say, look, I'm just doing what I was told. He doesn't do that. This may be one of those leadership lessons of a conqueror that we can take from the text and see it as a positive. We see how Gideon is able to stem the tide of greater rebellion and unrest within the tribes. It does indicate, however, here and in previous lessons and in later chapters of the book of Judges, that there has been this unrest and loose connection between the tribes throughout the history of the Judges. That's something to keep in mind all the while, that when they do find unity and help from all the tribes, they should certainly be happy about that, because it doesn't happen very often. What Gideon is able to do then is kind of bring them back together, and they are satisfied with his answer. Now, I do think that Gideon is being honest here. Part of me wants to say he's using a ploy just to keep everything from blowing up. I don't know. The text doesn't say. But what we've learned about Gideon up to this point has been that he's been growing in his understanding of his relationship with God. He's been growing in his understanding as a leader. Put on the side, on the back burner, if you will, for a moment, the fact that it may not stay that way. But for now, this seems to be the pinnacle of his ability to lead. Well, what happens then? They move on. Real quick before I move on there, I do want to note that some of the challenge, as some scholars have said, between Ephraim and other tribes, particularly Manasseh, we see, again, Gideon is from that region of Manasseh. If you know your history, you know that Ephraim and Manasseh were the two sons of Joseph. Manasseh got two portions of land. He was the older son. He was the bigger tribe. So he got his descendants, the tribe of Manasseh, got territory on the west side of the Jordan and on the east side of the Jordan. Ephraim was the younger brother in the relationship. They got a smaller portion, but they were stronger in many ways, as you can see their warrior abilities here. But one of the things you might see is that when Jacob, at the end of his life, went to bless Joseph's sons, he did as was done to him, although by deception. He blessed Ephraim, the younger son, as opposed to Manasseh, the younger or the older son. So what he did is he put his right hand on Ephraim, he put his left hand on Manasseh. Joseph tried to stop that and say, wait, Dad, you got it wrong. And Jacob goes, I'm doing exactly what I planned to do. And that's what was done for him. He received the blessing instead of his brother Esau. Of course, as we know, he did it by deception. There might have been some animosity between the tribes, and this might have just been Ephraim's opportunity to kind of point that out, to kind of say, why are you always doing this? Why are you always putting us on the back burner? Why are you always avoiding us? Who knows? What we do see is that Gideon is able to keep this from becoming worse. We're not going to be going any further into the book of Judges after chapter 8, but I want to bring up an event that's going to happen later under Jephthah, when Jephthah is battling the oppressors. What's going to happen in chapter 12, verses 1 to 6, is Ephraim is going to again be upset that Jephthah has not asked them for help. And you can read those verses. I'll just tell you, it doesn't go as well with Jephthah as it did with Gideon here. Well, some underlying currents there, some sibling rivalry. We've got an enemy that's being pursued. All the while, there's still the issue of the tribal unrest amongst the people groups there. They get that together. Ephraim is pleased. They're happy about the response that Gideon gives. And then what we see in chapter 8, verses 4 through 9, is the pursuit of the Midianites into the Transjordan region, into the area east of the Jordan. And here's where we're going to see some things happen that you're thinking, where did that come from? Why is this happening? But also the temptation to say, Gideon is simply doing what God told him to do, and he should be exonerated, or he should be not absolved, because I don't want to say it that way, but that he should be affirmed, or at least justified in doing what he's doing. Well, let me read the verses for you, then we'll come back and talk about them. Verses 4 through 9 read this way. Gideon and the 300 men came to the Jordan and crossed it. They were exhausted, but still in pursuit. He said to the men of Sukkoth, please give some loaves of bread to the troops under my command, literally at my feet, but you know what that means, under his command, because they are exhausted. So he says they're exhausted. The text says they're exhausted. He says they're exhausted. He says, for I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. So we've seen Oreb and Zeb, the princes of the army of the Midianites. Here we're seeing kings, leaders, higher ups. Sukkoth responds, but the princes of Sukkoth asked, are Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hands, that we should give bread to your army? Gideon replied, very well. When the Lord has handed Zebah and Zalmunna over to me, I will tear your flesh, literally thresh your flesh, with thorns and briars from the wilderness. He went from there to Penuel. Some of your translations may say Peniel with an I instead of a U. He went from there to Penuel and asked the same thing from them. The men of Penuel answered just as the men of Sukkoth had answered. He also said to the men of Penuel, when I return safely, I will tear down this tower. So what's going on? Well, they cross over, and as you saw on the map, Sukkoth and Penuel are on the east side, and they're not terribly far away from each other. One of the things the map doesn't show you is, the distance, but we're thinking about 12 miles from Abel Mehola, or Mehola, Abel Mehola, I know I can say it, from Abel Mehola down to about where they would cross over the river to get towards Sukkoth and Penuel. So they cross over and they are pursuing the Midianites. Again, we don't know the total number yet. In fact, even this text doesn't tell us the number. I'll give those numbers in a moment just to remind us of what we looked at. But what we get is, in the pursuit, we're told that the 300 are still there with Gideon, but now they're exhausted. They've been pursuing and pursuing and pursuing. And while they're exhausted, they don't stop. But once they get to Sukkoth, they do stop. Now, the question is, are Sukkoth and Penuel Israelite cities? We do know that they are in the territory of Gad, and it's very likely then that they are Israelites. And that's going to be a real problem as we encounter what takes place and how this exchange is occurring. But for now, we can leave it open with the belief that they are Israelites. Do you like the way I hedge like that? What happens first? Well, the first thing that Gideon does is he recognizes that his people are exhausted. He's trying to take care of them, as a good leader will, and he asks for help. He says simply, I need loaves of bread for my troops. They are exhausted. Response from the Sukkoth, the leaders of Sukkoth. They ask an interesting question. Do you have in your hand Zebah and Zalmunna already? Now, some of your translations may read a little bit more literalistically. When he says, do you have them in your hand? They're not just saying you have them, but maybe you've cut off their hands as proof that it's them. We saw the heads cut off of Oreb and Zeb earlier. They're asking something along those lines here. It could be that they're being honest and asking for a sign of the victory. But they also could be just hedging and hesitating and being oppositional toward Gideon. And that's the way he's going to take it. They basically are saying, if you don't have it, if you don't have proof, then we're not going to feed you. We're not going to give you help. The response that Gideon gives can be read one of two ways. He goes on and says, whenever the Lord gives us victory and I return, then I will thresh your flesh with thorns and briars from the wilderness. Now, one thing to note is that he does mention the Lord So he is at least acknowledging that. But what we're seeing from Gideon at this point now is less and less reference to God. And while this could be read as a sincere recognition that it's Yahweh giving them the victory, and it's going to be Yahweh that gives Gideon victory over these two kings as he's pursuing them, he could be just talking. Because what we're going to see moving forward is he's going to be acting as if he is the sole authority. So we have to keep that in mind. Certainly, though, what he's doing is he's bringing a threat against the people of Sukkoth. Now, the question is, how severe of a punishment would this be? Threshing their flesh with thorns and briars? Well, it would hurt. Some scholars have said it wouldn't be life-threatening, but it would certainly hurt. But it'd be like laying them down and then threshing them like they would be threshing wheat with the thorns and the briars on the ground. This may not be severe in some people's eyes, but it's certainly demeaning, it's certainly embarrassing, and it's certainly bringing shame. But that's the threat he has before them. When I come back, just know, because you didn't help us, I'm going to punish you. He goes on to Penuel or Peniel and does the same thing. The text at this point then shortens up the language and says he asked the same thing to them. Well, what was that? He's asking for bread. You see a common theme here is that what was Gideon doing when he first encountered God? He was threshing wheat in a wine press. He was trying to get the supplies ready and his ingredients ready to make bread. Now he's seeking bread. He's asking for bread. Now, clearly that's because that's what they would eat. But it's also curious that he's also seeking bread when the Midianite soldier in the camp in chapter 7 was having a dream about a loaf of bread coming down and destroying the camp. Well, he asks the people of Penuel for bread. They respond exactly the same way. And the author does here what he did with the request of Gideon. He just says they said the same thing. They responded in the same way as the men of Sukkoth. Gideon offers up a more severe punishment because they won't help. He says, when I return, I will tear down this tower. So the city has got a wall around, it's got a tower, and we're going to see when we get to the lesson next time more about that. Earlier, what's interesting as we look at the text, and a second kind of thing I was going to bring up is on one level, you have perhaps the men of Sukkoth and Penuel seeking a sign, maybe because they just don't trust Gideon. It may be this is another sign of the tension between tribes. Certainly Gideon is going to take this very personally. It could be that they're asking, how would I put it? They're asking sincerely, do you actually, have you won it? Maybe they're on the side of Gideon and want to know, do you have victory? But at the same time, it seems that they are not really wanting to do anything or have anything to do with Gideon. It may be also that the same kind of threat was brought by the Midianites. Now, we don't have that. But it's always good to speculate. It's always fun to speculate. It may not always be right to speculate. So what happens then? They ask for a sign. Do you have in your hand Zebah and Zalmunna? And he responds very harshly toward them. Why do I go to the extent of bringing that up? They may be having doubts and they want assurance. Isn't that the same thing that Gideon did with God when God first approached Gideon and offered assurance that he was going to bring victory? Gideon asked for the signs of first he asked for a sign indicating who the angel of the Lord was. And then he asked for a sign through the fleece twice. Then God offered up a sign. Interestingly enough, what happens is Gideon, in this case, when asked for a sign, does not respond in the positive way, even as God responded toward him in offering up the assurance that he was requesting. A couple things about that. As I was going through and preparing, I thought, as I was reading through different material and reading about what's happening with Gideon here, when he crossed the Jordan River, it seems like in his personality and his understanding of his own authority and leadership, he crossed the line. And I was thinking about that as I was reading along. And as I got to succeeding paragraphs in the commentary I was reading, that author goes on and says he crossed over, meaning crossed over the Jordan, and then he crossed the line. And he said that's a word that actually is used to talk about crossing the line, meaning transgressing a law or something like that. And I was thinking, I just thought that, and now he says it. Now I'm going to at least say that it was Lawson in his NIV application commentary who brought that up. As I was thinking also about Gideon's ingratitude, it seems, or his harsh treatment of the Sukkoth residents and those of Penuel, his harsh treatment when they asked for a sign, in light of the fact that God was so gracious in granting him a sign, I thought of the unmerciful servant. And as I kept reading in the commentary, said the same thing. And I thought, oh my goodness, what's going on here? Now I really got to give the man credit, because if I say it, not that he'd ever see this video, I want to make sure that I recognize that Lawson in his NIV application commentary was going along in the same direction. We seem to see Gideon crossing a line, if you will, from being a obedient, faithful servant to now being kind of a tyrant. And some of the literature has even used that term to describe him. Well, we see there that he's made threats, and our text stops there. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to stop there. I do want to bring up a couple of hints about what does take place. I'll give a couple of spoilers. And then what we want to do is kind of think about what's going on here. And it really becomes more pertinent when we look at our lesson next time as well. First, as I said at the beginning, when we look at Gideon here, we see him really faithful, growing in his faith, growing in his understanding, growing his relationship, being obedient, carrying out what God has called him to do. But remember back when they broke their pitchers and they shouted and blew their trumpets, what did they cry out? First, they were supposed to cry out for the Lord and for Gideon. But then when they actually cried out, they said, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. And we said that might be a hint of something to come. And as we're seeing now, it seems like as we move forward in the text, it's less about the Lord and it's more about Gideon. And as I said, if we read further in the next lesson, we'll see some of that manifest itself. But we're seeing something happening with Gideon here that, if we're honest with ourselves, if we're looking at the text honestly, it should trouble us. Not because Gideon can't have the authority to carry out what God's called him to do. The question is he carrying out what God has called him to do in the way God would be pleased with? Some have suggested that once Oreb and Zeb were killed and the Midianite armies had crossed over, at that point, what has happened? The oppressor has left. The threat is over. And yet Gideon pursues even further. The question is, has Gideon crossed over from being obedient to God as a judge to now carrying out something very, very personal? And what we'll do next week when we bring this study of Gideon, the Gideon cycle, to an end, is we're going to notice that there was something very personal going on when he eventually captures Zebah and Zalmunna. So what happens? Well, here's the spoiler alert. Yes, eventually, not long after this, Gideon and the 300 are going to pursue further, and they are going to find and capture Zebah and Zalmunna, and they will die. And then Gideon is going to come back, and he is going to carry out the threat that he made against Sukkoth and Penuel. Well, on one note, as we conclude, I want you to think about this. This is a rather interesting story in the book of Judges. We have seen, as we said, some positive things. We've seen some negative things. I want us to process all of that, because what we're dealing with here is a human being. We're not dealing with a perfect character. We're dealing with someone who is praised eventually in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, in the Hall of Faith, as someone who believed God, had faith in God that he would bring deliverance. There are some other characters in there for the book of Judges we might question. But the reality is that this is a chapter in the life of Israel where God is working to preserve them as a people. Even as they've disobeyed and gone under oppression, now that they have asked for help, he's giving them help. He loves them. And yet, what is he doing? He's using imperfect human instruments. And we're seeing that in Gideon. And I want to point that out and maybe overemphasize it for this reason. There are times when we give too much praise to Gideon, and yet the Bible itself is not. The Bible may not be speaking positively or negatively at this point, but from what we know of the biblical understanding of God in the text throughout, when we look at Gideon, we see that there are some things that he's doing that just don't measure up to God's standards. And where that's the case, we need to point that out. On another level, I want you to know that this may be the only place in the history of Israel where these four leaders, Oreb, Zebah, and Zalmunna, are mentioned. But if you go back and read Psalm 83, you're going to find there a Psalm of Asaph. And through there is a cry to God for help against their oppressors. And in the midst of that psalm, verses 9 through 12, what the psalm is going to say is seek to do to the oppressor, even as God did to Oreb and Zeb, to Zebah and Zalmunna, to the Midianites, to others, to Sisera and Jabin. They are also mentioned there. So there has been a remembrance of Israel throughout their history of these events that God has enacted for them. The fact is, of course, he's done it through an imperfect vessel. We do need to identify what the Bible merely reports when it speaks, and then we need to note when it actually either promotes or, in some cases, and in many cases, criticizes or condemns the action of a person. It's tempting to look at characters and think their only purpose in there is for us to figure out what is a quality to emulate or a quality to avoid. The text sometimes gives us clear indication and instruction that this is something not to do and something that we should do. Other times we can get caught up in a story like this and think Gideon's just making sure that the enemy is destroyed. He's carrying out God's plan. But is he doing it with God's plan in mind? Has he fully kept in mind that he's working for God and not for himself? Where there's praise, we give praise. Where there is criticism, we give criticism. Otherwise, we need to be mindful when the text is merely reporting what the person did without giving a positive or negative assessment of the action. We don't get either of those here. We just know what he did. But in our common sense and our sensibilities about the Old Testament as well, we look at that and we go, something just doesn't, as we would say, doesn't square up here. What's going on with Gideon at this point? This is a harbinger of some things to come, because as you continue to read chapter 8, as we will, and we'll look at some things at the end of chapter 8. Some things happen after the cycle of Gideon that are troubling too, but they all begin with Gideon starting here and shortly after. Gideon's a mixed bag, and much of what the text says about Gideon is being reported, and we are able to figure out what is going on just from what we know about the character of God. Next week, we're going to have our last lesson on Gideon, and it's covering a lot, so I'll show you the verses in a moment, but there's stuff that we're skipping here, and there's other matter that is going to be skipped at the end. I want to just kind of tie it all together. And then we have one more lesson after that, just kind of ties up all of our study, the book of Judges, together, and there we can make some more application. But as we look, we're going to see that during the conclusion of our study of Judges 1 through 8, we will take time to discuss the window that this book opens up for us to see of the people at the time. We can go back and look at Othniel and Ehud and Deborah and Shamgar. We'll look here again at Gideon. We may touch a little bit on Jephthah and Samson, not because we've studied them, but because that brings in a bigger picture of what's going on in this time period. I want to have a word of prayer with you, and then I want to speak briefly about what we will talk about next week. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for this day. We read your word, and there are times when we can just read it and feel so satisfied that you have given us something that we can apply to our lives. We grow closer to you. We learn more about who you are. And then there are other times we read your word and we know that there's an attitude or a characteristic to avoid. And then there are times we read your text and we're thinking, what do we do with this? We know that this particular character is trying to live for you, and yet they're doing things that seem to be so out of character of what you've taught them. Give us wisdom, give us discernment, give us the skill we need to read your word and to know what you're trying to teach us. In the meantime, we do reflect on who Gideon was, and we recognize even his flaws in our own lives. At times we want to be obedient, and then other times we just kind of want to do our own thing. We have our own agenda, and somehow you continue to use us. We know that you're giving Gideon as an example, or highlighting Gideon as a judge is not so much to say, hey, I recognize you all are going to mess up from time to time, and that's okay. We know that that's not what your message is. Your message is, in many ways, to look at what's going on in this and see that there are things that we should not do. We know that your word is much greater than just learning these character studies. In fact, we know the most important thing that we should be learning from these texts is who you are and who we are in relationship to you. We do pray that you will continue to teach us who we are in relationship to you day by day, and help us to live that out. Lord, we do pray you give us wisdom. Fill us with your spirit daily. Continue to guide us by your Spirit so that we may understand how you would live in us day by day. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Earlier, as I was talking and preparing for the lesson, I was thinking about this idea of a character who starts off good but becomes evil. Now, I'm not saying Gideon has become evil, but we've seen characters in literature and movies, we've seen them on TV, where they start off well and something happens and they turn bad. And you can see some of those in some of our comic books and other movies. There are different characters that do that. But I can also see in the biblical narrative some people who were good but did something bad. Think about Abraham, who believed God and was credited to him as righteousness, and yet on 2 occasions he tries to pass off his wife as his sister so as to avoid being killed. We see Moses getting angry and striking a rock when he was supposed to just speak to it. He strikes it twice. We see on other occasions, we see David starting off well and just really just messing things up in his family life and his relationship with God. We see it over and over again. The issue there is there are many times when we see that happen, it's very clear that what they've done is wrong and there's been a consequence for that. Here we're going to conclude the story of Gideon, and we don't get that. What we have to do is read what follows to get a sense of what's going on. Well, next week we will conclude our look at Gideon. And at the pace we've been going, we probably could spend a few more weeks, because now we're going to jump ahead in many ways and skip over some parts to get to the end. But I do want to gather all that up moving forward. Let me show you what our lesson for next week is going to be. We're going to be looking at Judges, and we're going to be looking specifically at, oops, did the wrong thing there. There it comes up. Hopefully you can see that. I'll come back to that in a moment. What we're going to be looking at next week is lesson 12, Judges chapter 8, verses 18 to 34. So you can see we stopped today at verse 9. We've skipped over some things. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. I already told you what's going to happen there anyway. But the text is entitled, or the lesson is entitled, How Quickly from Conquered to, or Conqueror to Conquered. I'll read this in a moment. How quickly from Conqueror to Conquered. And what we're going to see then is the closing of the loop, if you will, and then some preparation for what's going to follow after the life of Gideon. So I hope that you'll read that, and even that doesn't cover all of what's in Judges chapter 8, but we'll make sure to tie that in together. One of the things I want to remind you is that if you're interested, you can go and watch the videos that pertain to sermons preached by a professor or a pastor that my professor had, well, still has this year or these years, but a few years ago, these messages were preached. But go and look at his blog. He has some other insights. A couple of things I've said, I've derived from him. Others I've just, I've left it for him to say. And so I'd really encourage you to go read his multi-part series on the life of Gideon. And then there's the 4-part message on Gideon from the pastor. Let me figure out what I'm doing here. All right. Some days you just get confused. All right. But I do think it would be very valuable for you to go and look at those blogs and continue to learn about Gideon, continue to learn about what's going on in the book of Judges. We'll, as I said, in a couple of weeks, tie all this together and see if there's anything else we can take from this text in such a dark time in the history of Israel at this point. Well, I look forward to seeing you next time. I hope that you'll have a good week. I pray that you will use each day to worship the Lord, seek him out, and that he will continue to guide and direct you through his Holy Spirit, continue to conform you into the image of his Son. And until we see you again, I pray that you will be well and that you will be blessed.